A number of you have been asking me questions like, where is God in a coronavirus world, and is this a sign of the end times? And I'm assuming that as some of you have asked, many more are wondering. So I thought I'd give you a bit of input to stimulate your thinking. This is a relatively short talk, I'm guessing 15-20 minutes or so. So I won't be attempting to tackle the issues in great theological depth, but I hope it helps you as you wrestle with the issues for yourself. I think the first thing we should acknowledge is that none of us have experienced anything like this before, so it feels strange. And different people will quite naturally respond with different emotions, but perhaps one thing that most people feel at least a little is somewhat vulnerable. Someone asked me about the plagues talked of in the book of Revelation, the issue behind the question being whether we're in the end times the Bible speaks of or not. Now, you may have heard my general advice on the revelation of John before, and that is that it's best read quickly to get the general flow of the prophecy, that there is good and there is evil, there is God and there is Satan, there is a battle and God wins, and his people will be with him forever. In a nutshell, that's the prophecy that John delivers. The problems tend to come when we try to identify parts of that prophecy with specific historic events. And putting coronavirus and the COVID-19 disease in context, there have been many similar pandemics in the 2000 years or so since St. John wrote. For example, the Antonine Plague around AD 170 killed about 5 million people. The Justinian Plague around 551 killed about 25 million. The Black Death in the 14th century, it's estimated, killed between 70 and 100 million. And the Spanish flu of 1918, between 20 and 50 million. So coronavirus is not unprecedented in a biblical time frame. And it's not identifiable with any particular event in John's prophecy. It's just new to us. In our high-tech medicine 21st century world, it brings us face to face with our vulnerability in a new way, and with the ultimate statistic that 1 in 1 of us will die one day, and the ultimate truth that you can't avoid death. So the key is surely to be ready for it when it comes. Hence, I wouldn't try linking COVID-19 with any particular event in the book of Revelation, except to say that it prophesies that such things will happen. And COVID-19 doesn't change our vulnerability. It just highlights it and makes it more immediate. So that's the first issue. But perhaps the bigger question that the pandemic throws up is, where is God in this coronavirus world? It's actually just a version of the age-old question. If God is good and God is powerful, how come there is suffering in the world? Now, if anyone tells you that's a neat, easy answer to that, I would be very skeptical, because bigger brains than ours have been wrestling with it for centuries. But I do believe that the Christian faith has more helpful things to say about it than any other theistic or atheistic worldview. So let's skim quickly over the outlines of the discussion. Philosophers often speak in terms of two types of evil which cause pain and suffering. First, there is moral evil, things that happen because of the choices of people. The ruins of the old Coventry Cathedral would be a clear reminder of such suffering. Now, we'll come back to the part of moral evil in our current crisis in a moment. But secondly, there's natural evil, things like earthquakes and floods and cancer and coronavirus fit into this category. Now, obviously, there are sometimes links between the two. So deforestation caused by greed can be the cause of floods, for example. And it's been speculated that illegal animal trading may have led to the coronavirus leaping from animals to humans. And there are questions about how the epidemic was handled early on in China. And in time, people's desire for someone to blame will no doubt try and find the truth. But in large part, the question facing us with coronavirus is simply that of natural evil. And we need to try and make sense of it intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. Now, I'm not a qualified virologist, epidemiologist, or psychologist, so my focus is going to be on a spiritual understanding. But clearly these three things overlap somewhat. For example, the intellectual question of why did this person die and this person live becomes a profoundly emotional issue if you know the people involved. So let's explore this question of natural evil a bit. And how we approach it will depend upon our worldview. Now, there are basically three families of worldviews, albeit with significant differences between the families or within the families. First, there's the theistic worldview, where from a Christian viewpoint, a Judeo-Christian viewpoint, there is a God who created the world and who made people in his image. Secondly, there's an atheistic worldview, where what we see is all there is. There is no supernatural dimension or guiding power. And thirdly, there are the pantheistic worldviews, where the ideas of God and world merge into one concept. And in this short talk, I'm not going to address the issue of pantheism because most of you will be engaging with theists and atheists, not with pantheists. But your worldview will profoundly affect how you perceive something like the coronavirus pandemic. If you have an atheistic worldview, the only real way to respond is to say that, well, it's just how it is. The universe is hard and unfeeling. In a world with nothing more than atomic particles and selfish genes, some people get hurt. Now, I think the obvious weakness in that argument is that it replaces the concepts of good and evil with simple fatalism. So coronavirus is not an evil, it's just how it is. And something like terrorists carrying out awful acts are just following their inbuilt genetic programming. But most of us instinctively react against the idea that there is no ultimate good and evil. It's as if we're wired, created, you might say, with that moral understanding deep inside us. Dostoevsky once said, if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. Now, that's not saying that atheists cannot act morally, but it questions what morality means if there is no transcendent God who sets the standards. If you cast God aside, logically, you have to abolish the meaningfulness of moral right and wrong as well. Friedrich Nietzsche, whose famous slogan was "God is dead," also said that the consequence of abandoning biblical morality in Western civilization would be that the strong would eliminate the weak, and that the logical outworking of atheism and the selfish gene is just that. Incidentally, you may have seen one of my favorite pieces of graffiti where someone wrote, "God is dead, Nietzsche," and underneath someone else wrote, "Nietzsche is dead, God." Anyway, questions like what is morally right and morally wrong have never been properly answered, in my opinion, outside of religious discussion. So, from an atheist's worldview, there is not a lot of comfort to be gained. We can look forward not only to a harsh world driven by subatomic particles, but to harsh people driven by selfish genes. Then it all ends when we die. No judgment, no vindication, nothing. I don't see much hope in such a position. So, to a theistic worldview, specifically a Christian worldview. Here we have a very different problem to address, and it's how can there be a coronavirus if God is loving? Well, from this Christian viewpoint, we now have to bring both moral and natural evil back into play. We live in a world where disasters happen, and where humans are able to choose to do wrong or right. Why is the world this way? Well, here's a brief version of the Bible's answers. And it's that God created a world that was good, but he gave us the marvelous gift of free will. And that turns us into moral beings, made in God's image and entrusted with care of his creation. We're different from the animals. If a tiger mauls a zookeeper, it's not charged with murder. Animals are amoral. We are not. Genesis chapter 3 says that human disobedience arose from disagreement with God over the nature of life and the possibility of death. Well, having been explicitly warned by God that some things were off limits, we disobeyed. The fall, as the Bible describes it in Genesis chapter 3, means that not only were people's relationship with God fractured, but the natural world itself is fractured by the same event because nature had been put under our stewardship. In Romans 8 verse 20, St. Paul talks about nature being frustrated because it cannot be all it's meant to be due to human sin. The world described at the start of the Bible in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 as the perfect Garden of Eden. And the world described at the very end of the Bible in Revelation chapter 21, where heaven and earth are reunited, are remarkably similar. The key issues being that in both, God is with his people in close relationship, and all of creation is in order and in balance. We live in the middle of time, while the relationship between creator and creation is impaired by the sin of us, whom God put on earth to rule over it and to steward it. Therefore, from a Christian viewpoint, our moral failure is linked to the way the natural world is out of balance. The simplistic argument that says, why doesn't God just stop evil people then, is hugely problematic too, because the dividing line of good and evil cuts right through the heart of every single one of us. What people tend to want is that other people's evil is stopped, but that theirs is allowed. Well, that's not a tenable argument. Indeed, we could rephrase the question of why does God allow evil as, if I do and think evil, why does a good God tolerate me? But for however long we debate what a good, loving and all-powerful God should, could or might have done, the truth is that we will not find an outcome that satisfies us all. And sometimes when we're faced with an unanswerable question, we realize we might be better off approaching the issue with a different question. We have to accept that we're in a universe that presents us both with biological beauty and with deadly pathogens. That there are deep flaws both in human nature and in physical nature. So rather than questioning why a loving God created a world where there is evil, a different question could be, in this world where evil exists, is there evidence that there's a God whom we can trust with the implications of that, and who we can trust with our lives and our futures? And that, for the Christian, is where we must turn to the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Christian claim is that God entered this suffering world and became very much part of it. For me personally, the most helpful way to address the issue of suffering is to look at Jesus, God incarnate, upon the cross. I cannot look him in the face while he hangs there and tell him that he doesn't understand suffering. Not only has he been through it, but the good news of the Christian faith is the claim that as the only perfect human, Jesus' sacrifice on the cross made it possible for our relationship with God to be restored. That whatever happens in this life, we can be part of the new heaven and the new earth, where there is no crying or mourning or pain. A Christian is therefore not a person who has solved the problem of pain, suffering and the coronavirus, but one who has come to love and trust a God who has himself suffered. And part of that belief is that ultimately there is not only mercy and forgiveness, but also healing and justice and restoration. Christians can and surely should have an eternal perspective on current suffering. C.S. Lewis, when writing about the threat of atomic bombs in the 50s and 60s, said, "If they do fall, they should find us doing the normal things of life, the good things. Bombs can break our bodies, but they do not need to dominate our minds." I think that advice plays well in this age of coronavirus too. Coronavirus is so named because it looks like a crown. In a sense, we have to choose whether we are at the mercy of the crown of the coronavirus or at the mercy of Jesus, who wore a crown of thorns on our behalf and now wears the crown of the King of all. Part of our trusting God and submitting to Jesus' kingship is for us to choose to pray. To pray, "Your kingdom come," says, first of all, "Jesus, you are King and I trust you." But it also says, "I trust in that kingdom rule for all eternity, and I'm asking for more of that eternal rule to break into today." As John Wimber used to say, we ask for tomorrow's bread today. That's why we're encouraging you to join in with things like the Unite 714 prayer initiative. It's a trusting and a faith-filled response to the pandemic to pray. There are a lot of other issues I could talk about. For example, the science that the vast majority of viruses are not harmful, but actually essential to life on Earth. That starts to put the existence of coronavirus in context. Or while we see tectonic plate movements as harmful earthquakes, there's good science to suggest that without tectonic plate movement, many of the processes that enable and sustain life on this planet would not exist. And on the whole issue of whether pain is always a bad thing, we know that it's often there to protect the body from further physical damage. And at an emotional level, is it not the human experience that it's through pain that we often grow in character the most? That was certainly my experience of 3 years of cancer treatment. So, if you were hoping for nice, neat answers when you started listening, I don't believe there are any. As St. Paul wrote, "We see through a glass dimly. Much is still a mystery to us." But I hope the things I've shared with you give you some food for thought that might actually strengthen your faith. Because while there are not neat answers, there is plenty of good evidence and plenty of good arguments to give us deep hope for the future. Don't let the things you do know about God be spoiled by the things that you don't yet understand. So, as a church, we will continue to worship an unchanging God. We'll just do it differently. We'll continue to develop our own relationships with this God, not being overwhelmed by the current situation. We will continue to serve our community, but in this socially distanced and lockdown world, we'll do it differently. We'll continue to connect with each other through phones and electronic communication and even just talking over the garden fence. Because in the light of eternity, coronavirus and the COVID-19 disease it creates will pass away. But the words of Jesus and the promises he made will never pass away.